My life had completely changed that night, and I never saw it coming. It was supposed to be a normal evening, just like any other, but sometimes fate has a way of throwing you into situations you never expect. One moment, I was driving home after a long, exhausting day, and the next, I was pulling over to the side of the road, my heart pounding as flashing red and blue lights reflected in my rearview mirror. I wasn't even sure why I was being pulled over. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, my mind racing through every possible reason as I watched the silhouette of the officer approaching in my side mirror. I had been driving within the speed limit, my taillights were working, and I hadn't touched my phone the entire time. Still, the sinking feeling in my chest told me this was going to be more than just a routine stop. When the cop finally reached my window, I lowered it slowly, the cool night air brushing against my face as I glanced up at him. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and had the kind of presence that made it impossible to look away. His uniform fit snugly over his muscular frame, his belt weighed down with everything from a radio to a pair of handcuffs, and his expression was unreadable as he looked down at me with piercing eyes. "License and registration," he said, his deep voice steady and firm, but not unkind. I fumbled slightly as I reached into my glove compartment, my fingers shaking just a little as I handed over my documents. Something about his presence made my pulse quicken, and I wasn't sure if it was nerves or something else entirely. He studied my license for a moment before glancing back at me. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" I shook my head, swallowing hard. "No, officer. I really don't." There was a pause, a brief moment of silence stretching between us before he spoke again. "Your left tail light is out." I blinked, surprised. That was it? A tail light? I hadn't even noticed, but I could already feel the tension in my shoulders easing slightly. "Oh, I didn't realize. I can get it fixed first thing in the morning." He nodded but didn't hand my license back right away. Instead, his gaze lingered on me for just a second longer than necessary, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. "You been drinking tonight?" I shook my head quickly. "No, not at all. Just heading home from work." Another pause. He seemed to be studying me, like he was trying to figure something out, and the longer he stood there, the more aware I became of the way my skin prickled under his scrutiny. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he finally handed my license back. "Step out of the car." My heart skipped a beat. "What?" "You heard me," he said, his voice calm but commanding. "Step out of the vehicle." I hesitated for just a moment before unbuckling my seatbelt and pushing open the door. The night air was cooler than I expected, and as I stood in front of him, I suddenly felt small compared to his towering frame. His gaze flickered over me briefly before he took a step closer, close enough that I could see the sharp angles of his jaw and the way his lips pressed together in something that wasn't quite a frown. "Turn around," he instructed. I swallowed, my breath unsteady as I slowly did as he said. My heart was pounding so hard that I could barely hear anything else, and when I felt his hand brush lightly against my shoulder, a shiver ran down my spine. This was supposed to be a routine traffic stop, but nothing about it felt routine anymore. I stood motionless, my back turned, my breath uneven as the cold night air pressed against my skin, sending a shiver down my spine. My pulse pounded in my ears, drowning out everything else except the sound of his boots against the pavement as he stepped closer. Every part of me was on high alert, my hands twitching slightly at my sides, unsure of what to expect next. "Spread your feet apart," he instructed, his voice firm but controlled, making it clear that I had no choice but to obey. I did as he said, feeling the weight of his presence behind me, his body close enough that I could almost feel the warmth radiating from him. His hands moved against my sides in a brief but deliberate pat down. Nothing unusual, nothing inappropriate, yet somehow, it left a trail of heat wherever his fingers brushed. "You're clean," he muttered, his voice quieter than before, as if he had expected a different outcome but wasn't sure why. I turned to face him again, my breathing slightly uneven, my chest rising and falling faster than it should have been. His eyes locked onto mine for a second too long, like he was searching for something, debating something, trapped between a decision and an impulse. "Is there a problem, officer?" I asked, forcing my voice to sound steady, though my pulse was anything but calm. "Hey, thanks for watching until this point. Please leave a comment if you're enjoying the video. It really helps us grow the channel and reach more people. And hey, thank you very much. Let's get back to story." He hesitated, his gaze flickering downward for the briefest moment before returning to meet mine, something unreadable flashing behind his eyes. The silence between us stretched, thick and charged, an invisible tension pressing against the space between us like an unspoken challenge. "You need to get that taillight fixed," he finally said, his voice quieter now, his tone carrying something else beneath the authority, something he wasn't willing to acknowledge. "I will," I murmured, swallowing hard, my throat suddenly dry as I fought the strange pull keeping me rooted in place. Neither of us moved. The moment hung between us, stretched thin by the weight of everything we weren't saying, by the silent acknowledgement of something neither of us could name. Then, just as I finally convinced myself to step away, his fingers brushed against my wrist. Not a grip, not a demand, just the lightest touch. A warning, promise, a confirmation. This wasn't over. Not even close. The moment his fingers brushed against my wrist, my breath hitched, my body frozen in place as the air between us grew impossibly thick. It wasn't a command, it wasn't a mistake. It was deliberate, subtle, and dangerous in a way that sent a slow, burning heat through my chest. Every rational thought told me to step back, to walk away, to let this moment fade into nothing more than a strange, unspoken interaction. But I didn't move. Neither did he. His grip tightened slightly, just enough to make my pulse spike, his fingers lingering like he was testing the weight of the decision we were about to make. The distant sound of traffic felt muted, the rest of the world slipping away as my focus narrowed on the way his body remained close. His breath steady but controlled, like he was holding something back. "You should go," he murmured, though the way he said it lacked conviction. His voice softer now, lower, almost careful. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, my thoughts tangled in the storm of whatever this was, whatever we had stepped into without realizing. "Then let go," I whispered, my voice quieter than I intended, my fingers twitching slightly under the heat of his touch. He didn't. His eyes locked onto mine, dark and unreadable, his jaw tight, his body rigid, as if caught between the need to maintain control and the overwhelming pull to give in. My heart pounded, my breath shallow as the space between us seemed to shrink, the tension pressing in from all sides, suffocating but intoxicating. Then, before I could even process what was happening, he moved. His grip on my wrist pulled me forward, his body shifting just enough that I was suddenly closer, the scent of his cologne filling my senses, the warmth of his chest inches from mine. My breath stuttered as his fingers skimmed up my forearm. Slow, testing, deliberate. "This is a mistake," he muttered, his voice strained, like he was fighting a battle he already knew he would lose. "Then stop," I challenged, my own restraint hanging by a thread, my skin burning from the heat radiating off him. He exhaled sharply, his fingers tightening once more before, in a single breathless second. His lips crashed against mine. It wasn't gentle, it wasn't hesitant. It was desperate, urgent, filled with weeks of tension that neither of us had been willing to acknowledge until now. My hands found his shirt, gripping tightly as his fingers tangled into my hair, pulling me closer, his body pressing against mine in a way that made my entire world tilt. The parking lot was dark, the risk of being seen heightening every touch, every kiss, every heated second where we let go of every rational thought and surrendered to whatever had been building between us. His hands explored my body with a hunger that sent shivers down my spine, the weight of his frame pinning me against the car as his lips moved with reckless abandon. There was no hesitation now, no second-guessing. Just heat, just desire, just the raw, unspoken truth neither of us had wanted to admit. And just like that, the line was crossed. The moment his lips crashed against mine, everything else faded. The cold night air, the distant hum of passing cars, the consequences that should have stopped us before we even started. His hands gripped my waist with firm, undeniable possession, pulling me closer until there was no space left between us. My fingers twisted into the fabric of his uniform, feeling the steady rise and fall of his chest against mine, the heat of his body pressing into me with a force that left me breathless. I had never felt anything like this before. His mouth was urgent, his breath uneven as he tilted his head, deepening the kiss, as if the weeks of restraint had built into something he could no longer control. Every move he made sent another jolt of electricity through me, his hands sliding from my waist to the small of my back, pressing me harder against the cool metal of my car. "This is insane," he muttered against my lips, his voice rough with something between frustration and need. But he didn't stop. He didn't pull away. "Then stop," I whispered, barely able to get the words out between the fevered rush of kisses, my pulse hammering in my ears, my body already betraying any last shred of hesitation. He growled softly, a deep sound of surrender, before claiming my mouth again, his grip tightening as if he needed to hold onto something solid to ground himself. My head was spinning, my breath shallow as his hands roamed lower, gripping, exploring, pushing the boundaries we had already shattered. The distant sound of an approaching car sent a spike of adrenaline through my chest, a stark reminder of where we were, what we were doing, how reckless this had become. He froze for half a second, his breathing heavy, his forehead pressing against mine as if fighting for control. "Not here," he said, his voice strained, his hands still gripping me like he wasn't ready to let go. I nodded, swallowing hard, my skin still burning from his touch, my body aching from the space suddenly placed between us. He stepped back, his gaze locked onto mine, his lips slightly swollen from our kisses, his chest still rising and falling in unsteady breaths. The weight of what we had just done lingered between us, thick and undeniable, but instead of regret, all I saw in his eyes was hunger. "Get in the car," he murmured, his voice lower now, rougher, filled with a promise I wasn't sure I was ready to process. I sat back in my seat, running a shaky hand through my hair as I stared at the dashboard, my mind slowly catching up to reality. This had happened. We had crossed a line that couldn't be erased, had let whatever tension had been building between us explode into something undeniable, something reckless, something neither of us could take back. Beside me, he was quiet, his head tilted back against the seat, his jaw clenched, his chest still rising and falling in slow, measured breaths. He hadn't moved since we stopped, and I wasn't sure if that was a good thing or not. After a long moment, he finally exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face before turning his head to look at me. His gaze was unreadable, but there was something behind it, something deep, something conflicted, something that made my stomach tighten in ways I didn't fully understand. "This is insane," he muttered, his voice rough, like he was trying to convince himself more than me. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to meet his eyes even though part of me wasn't sure I wanted to hear whatever was coming next. "Do you regret it?" The silence that followed was unbearable. He didn't answer right away, and with each second that passed, my chest felt tighter, my pulse a little slower, my heart bracing for impact. But then, finally, he spoke. "No." The word hung in the air between us, heavier than anything else that had been said tonight. My shoulders loosened just slightly, my breath evening out as I searched his face, trying to understand exactly what this meant. "But it can't happen again," he added, and just like that, the air left my lungs all over again. I turned away, staring out the windshield, watching as the faint glow of distant streetlights flickered in the reflection. "Right?" I murmured, though the word felt foreign in my mouth, like something I wasn't sure I actually believed. "I mean it," he said, his voice firm, though there was something underneath it, something almost hesitant, like he wasn't sure if he wanted to believe it himself. I let out a quiet laugh, shaking my head as I leaned back into the seat. "Then why does it feel like you're lying?" He didn't answer. Instead, he reached for his belt, adjusting himself before sitting up straighter, his jaw tightening again, his entire body slipping back into control, into the version of himself that didn't let emotions get the best of him. He didn't look at me as he reached for the door handle, but I could feel it. The weight of everything we weren't saying pressing against the space between us. "Stay out of trouble," he muttered, and then, without another word, he pushed the door open and stepped out. I watched as he walked away, his posture stiff, his hands clenched at his sides like he was still fighting something he couldn't control. I wanted to say something, to stop him, to demand that he be honest about what we both knew wasn't over. But I didn't, because maybe, just maybe, he was right. Maybe this was a mistake. Maybe this was nothing more than a reckless moment we weren't supposed to have. Or maybe, just maybe, this was only the beginning. As I gripped the steering wheel and stared at the empty seat beside me, I realized that no matter how much we tried to pretend otherwise, no matter how much he told himself this couldn't happen again, we both knew it would.